Before we talk about the strength, before we talk about the failure, before we talk about the chains and the darkness and the grinding millstone, and the final prayer that changed everything, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to Samson's beginning. Before that, to the moment when a woman who had been told by her own body, and by the silent years, and by every reasonable expectation available to her, that motherhood was not something her life was going to contain, that woman received a visitor she was not expecting. The angel of the Lord appeared to the wife of Manoah. The text of Judges chapter 13 does not describe an elaborate visitation with great ceremony or extended preparation. The angel simply appeared, and the first words out of his mouth were a direct address to the deepest wound this woman had been carrying. "You are barren and have not borne children." That acknowledgement, naming the pain plainly, without softening or circumnavigation, was not cruelty. It was the specific precision of a God who was about to speak directly into the exact place where hope had died, and who needed the woman to know that he saw it clearly, all of it, before he said what he was about to say next. "But you shall conceive and bear a son." 5 words that dissolved years of grief, and years of silent waiting, and years of the specific kind of shame that childlessness carried in the ancient world, where a woman's worth was so thoroughly conflated with her fertility that the inability to conceive was experienced, not just as personal loss, but as evidence of divine disfavor. 5 words that reopened a future that had been sealed shut. And then, before the woman had even processed the promise, the angel continued with instructions that made clear this was not simply a birth announcement. This child had a purpose. He would be a Nazirite to God from the womb. He shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. I want to stay with this opening for a moment because I think it establishes something about this story that everything else depends on. Something that is easy to miss when you move too quickly toward the famous parts. Samson did not begin as a strong man. He began as a promise. He began as the specific, chosen, intentionally created answer to a situation that required something that did not yet exist. Before he had drawn a breath, before he had taken a single step, before any of the choices that would define and ultimately nearly destroy his life had been made. He was already known and already called and already set apart for a purpose that the world would eventually see, demonstrated in ways that left no room for a natural explanation. Here is the theological reality underneath that fact, and I want you to hold it not as an abstract idea, but as something that has a direct and personal claim on your own life. The God who appeared to Manoah's wife did not look at a barren woman in an obscure Israelite family and think to himself, "Well, this is not the most promising raw material, but let me see what I can do with it." He appeared to her specifically in the specific barrenness of her specific situation, because that specific situation was exactly the canvas he had chosen. The impossibility was not the problem to be overcome before the story could begin. The impossibility was the point. It was the signature he was going to put on everything that followed. The undeniable evidence that what Samson was and what Samson did could not be accounted for by any factor that was available to the natural eye. I want to speak to someone who is watching this and who has been told by something, by circumstances, by people, by the accumulated evidence of their own history, by the specific and familiar internal voice that you already know the sound of, that their life does not contain the raw material for anything remarkable, that the background they came from and the mistakes they have made and the resources they do not have and the doors that have not opened for them constitute a cumulative case for insignificance that is simply too strong to argue against, that the story of their life is heading somewhere ordinary, somewhere, unremarkable, somewhere that future generations will not feel the need to record or remember. Manoah's wife heard that voice for years. The silent evidence of barrenness is one of the most relentless and most quiet forms of that message, and she lived with it long enough that it would have become the operating assumption of her existence. And then the angel appeared, not because she had earned the visitation, not because she had demonstrated sufficient faith or sufficient worthiness or sufficient patience, because God had decided in the way that God decides. Things from outside the timeline, from the perspective that sees the ending before the beginning is fully begun. That this was the woman through whom the specific person he needed was going to come. The barrenness was not a disqualification. It was the backdrop against which the miracle would be most unmistakably visible. You were born on purpose, not as a general theological statement about human dignity that applies to everyone, and therefore means something slightly diffuse when applied to you specifically. You, with your specific history and your specific wounds, and your specific losses and your specific circumstances that seem to argue against anything significant. Emerging from where you are, you were born on purpose. Before you existed, a purpose for your existence existed. The same God who appeared to a barren woman in Zorah and announced a child who would begin to save Israel is the God who determined that you would exist in this time, in this place, with this specific combination of experiences and capacities, for reasons that your current vantage point may not yet allow you to see. Samson's story does not begin with his strength. It begins with God's intention, and so does yours. The strength was real. Let me be clear about that before anything else, because part of what makes Samson's story so compelling and so devastating is that the power he possessed was not metaphorical or symbolic or a matter of spiritual perception. It was physical, visible, undeniable, and it operated at a scale that left no room for alternative explanations. When the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, as the text of Judges describes it happening multiple times, the results were the kind of thing that people still talked about a generation later. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands as though it were a young goat, and the text specifically notes that he had nothing in his hand. He struck down 30 men in Ashkelon in what appears to have been an almost instantaneous altercation. He tied 300 foxes together in pairs by their tails, attached torches, and released them into the Philistine grain fields, which tells you something about both the extent of his physical capability and the particular quality of his strategic thinking. And at a place called Lehi, surrounded by 1,000 Philistines who were prepared and organized and certain of their numerical advantage, he picked up the fresh jawbone of a donkey and killed every single one of them. One man, 1,000 soldiers, a jawbone. The arithmetic only works if the variable you are calculating with is not the man, but the God whose spirit was moving through him. Now here is where the story gets theologically complicated, in a way that I think is important to address directly, because there is a version of Samson's story that reduces his power to a simple formula and draws from it a simple lesson. And that version, while not entirely wrong, misses the depth of what is actually being demonstrated here. The formula goes like this. Samson's power was connected to his hair. His hair was connected to the Nazirite vow, and as long as he kept the vow, the power stayed. And when he broke the vow by allowing his hair to be cut, the power left. True? But the formula is not the lesson. The formula is the surface. The lesson is underneath it. The Nazirite vow was not a magic spell. The 7 locks of hair were not the source of the power in any inherent physical or mystical sense. Samson's strength did not reside in his hair follicles. What the hair represented was something deeper and more important than any particular physical attribute. It was the visible, daily, publicly observable sign of a life that had been set apart. It was the external evidence of an internal reality, the reality of a specific relationship between this specific man and the God who had called him before his birth for a specific purpose. The vow was not the power. The vow was the maintained condition of a relationship, and the relationship was the source of everything. This is the distinction that makes Samson's story relevant beyond its historical particularity and directly applicable to the lives of people who are watching this right now. The gift, the supernatural capacity to do what God called him to do, was inseparable from the maintained relationship with the God who gave it. Not because God was applying an arbitrary rule or setting up a test to see if Samson would comply, but because power and holiness are not independent commodities that can be possessed separately. The power was the presence. When the presence remained, the power remained. When the relationship was maintained, the capacity was maintained. These were not two separate things. They were one thing, and the vow was the daily discipline of keeping that one thing intact. I want to be honest about how uncomfortable this makes the comfortable version of American Christianity, because I think the discomfort is the point, and avoiding it does no one any favors. There is a version of Christian faith that has been presented to an entire generation of believers, perhaps especially in the American context, with its particular cultural emphasis on grace as the opposite of demand, in which the gifts and the calling of God are presented as essentially unconditional. You are saved, you are gifted, you are called. And while God certainly hopes you will live in a way that reflects your identity, the functional gifts He has placed in your life will keep operating regardless of how you are actually living. The calling is irrevocable, the gifts are permanent, and the way you are living the day to day. Reality of your life does not particularly affect the spiritual capacity that God has given you. Samson's story is a direct and extended argument against that version of Christianity, not against grace. The grace in this story is overwhelming. And we are going to spend several chapters looking at exactly how overwhelming it is, but against the idea that the power of God operates independently of the condition of the relationship between the person and God. The power flowed through the relationship. The relationship required maintenance. The maintenance took the form of a covenant that was visible in daily life. And when the covenant was finally completely broken, not gradually weakened, but specifically violated in the most direct possible way, the power did not simply diminish. It left. What is the covenant in your life? What is the daily, visible, sometimes inconvenient expression of your specific commitment to the specific God who called you for a specific purpose? Not as a legalistic checklist that earns God's favor, but as the genuine, lived expression of a relationship that is real and requires the same kind of attention and priority that any real relationship requires. Because the lesson of Samson's strength is not simply that God can make people supernaturally powerful. The lesson is that the power and the relationship are the same thing, and maintaining one requires maintaining the other. She was not the first. That is something the text of Judges makes clear before we ever arrive at Delilah. And it matters for understanding how Samson got to the place where he did. There was a woman in Timnah, a Philistine woman, whom Samson saw and wanted and pursued against the explicit counsel of his parents, who pointed out that there were plenty of Israelite women, and asked the reasonable question of why he needed to find a wife from among the uncircumcised Philistines. Samson's answer, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes," is one of the repeated refrains of his life, and it sounds its note of warning here at the beginning of his pattern with women before the pattern reaches its catastrophic conclusion. He was a man who led with his eyes in context where the eyes were the most unreliable guide available. Then there was the prostitute in Gaza, the visit that prompted the Gazites to surround the city and wait in ambush at the gate, intending to kill him in the morning, and that resulted in Samson getting up at midnight and tearing the city. Gate, posts and bar and all, off its foundation, and carrying it on his shoulders to the top of a hill overlooking Hebron, a display of supernatural strength so extraordinary that it almost distracts from the situation that occasioned it. And then there was Delilah in the valley of Sorek. The text does not tell us she was beautiful, but everything about the story tells us she was something more effective than beautiful. She was intimate. She was the woman he loved, not visited, not desired in the way of the woman at Timnah or the woman in Gaza. Loved. And that distinction is what made her dangerous, in a way that no Philistine army had ever been able to be. The lords of the Philistines came to her with a proposition. Each of them would pay her 1,100 pieces of silver if she could discover the source of Samson's great strength and the means by which he could be bound and subdued. 5 lords at 1,100 pieces each, that is a fortune that would have been difficult to refuse, even for someone with no personal grievance against the man being asked about. And Delilah, whatever her feelings for Samson were, made the decision to accept it. What followed was a process of erosion that is one of the most psychologically accurate portraits of manipulation in ancient literature. She asked him directly where his great strength came from and how he could be bound. He lied to her. She bound him with the described materials, called out that the Philistines were upon him. He woke and snapped the bonds as though they were nothing. She told him he had made a fool of her and lied to her. He lied again with a different story. The same sequence repeated. She tried the 3rd time. He lied a 3rd time. And then the text records the mechanism of his eventual capitulation with a simplicity that makes it all the more devastating. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. He was so troubled, so worn down, so exhausted by the relentless pressure of the person whose nearness he could not give up, that he told her everything, the sacred thing, the thing that was not his to give. He told her that a razor had never touched his head because he had been a Nazirite to God from his mother's womb, and if his head were shaved, his strength would leave him. I want to spend some time here with the mechanism of what happened, because I think it is one of the most honest portraits of how the strongholds in our lives actually fall. They rarely fall to frontal assault. They rarely fall to the enemies we can see coming, the temptations we can identify clearly, the dangers we have been warned about explicitly and have our defenses erected against. The 1,000 Philistines at Lehi were a threat that Samson was perfectly equipped to handle. He knew what they were, he knew what they wanted, and the Spirit of God moved through him with devastating efficiency. He did not struggle against the army. The army was the kind of opposition that Samson was built for. Delilah was not the kind of opposition that Samson was built for. She was not an army. She was intimacy and persistence and the daily gentle pressure of someone who had access to the places in him that no military force could reach. She was the person whose presence he wanted enough to stay in, even when staying was dangerous. She was the relationship that mattered to him enough that he would rather endure the discomfort of her persistent questioning than remove himself from her nearness. And the persistence, day after day after day, the same question, the same implication that his refusal to answer was evidence that he did not really love her. The same emotional pressure applied to the same vulnerable place wore through him the way water wears through stone. Not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily, patiently, persistently, until the resistance gave way. This is the pattern of every Delilah that has ever operated in anyone's life, and I use the term not to be dramatic. but because I think naming it clearly is the only way to make it visible before it finishes its work. The thing that is draining your spiritual strength is probably not the thing that looks obviously dangerous. It is probably the thing you love. The relationship that has this specific texture of persistent pressure toward the compromises that matter most. The habit that has its fingers in the place where your covenant with God is maintained. The environment or the community or the daily routine that asks nothing dramatic of you, but applies a gentle, consistent, patient pressure in the direction of the thing you gave God, day after day after day, until your soul is vexed to death, and the thing you should have protected is lying open on the table. Delilah had lulled him to sleep on her knees, and while he slept, she called for a man and had him shave the 7 locks of his head. And the Bible records what happened when Samson woke up, and it is one of the most heartbreaking sentences in the entire book of Judges, perhaps in the entire Old Testament. He did not know that the Lord had left him. He did not know. That is the detail that makes this moment so theologically devastating, and it is a detail I want you to sit with before we move past it, because I think it contains the most important warning in this entire story. He woke up. He felt Delilah's familiar presence. He heard her voice, the voice that had been asking the question for days and weeks and had finally gotten the answer it was looking for. "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he rose to meet them the way he had risen every other time, with the same confidence, the same expectation, the same assumption that what had always been available to him would be available to him now. He did not know. He had no idea. The departure of the Spirit of God from his life had apparently been so undramatic, so quiet, so completely unaccompanied by any obvious signal or warning, that when it happened, he did not notice it. He slept through it. And when he woke, the gap between what he had been and what he now was had not yet registered anywhere in his conscious experience. He still felt like Samson. He still thought like Samson. He still expected to respond to this threat the way Samson responded to threats. And the difference between his expectation and his reality was not going to be visible until the moment he needed the power and reached for it and found nothing there. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles and set him to grinding at the mill in the prison. The man who had killed 1,000 men with a jawbone was now a slave grinding grain in a Philistine dungeon. The man whose strength had been the most undeniable supernatural reality in the region was now being led by the hand and pointed at a millstone and left to push the grinding wheel in the dark. It was a reversal so complete, so thorough, so symbolically precise. The eyes that had led him to his downfall were now gone, and the hands that had once carried the jawbone of a donkey were now carrying the weight of captivity that it reads like judgment, which in one sense it was. But I want to draw your attention to the aspect of this passage that I find most challenging, because I think it is the aspect that speaks most directly to the experience of a significant number of people who would describe themselves as Christians in America today. The aspect is not the dramatic capture or the physical degradation, as terrible as those things were. The most devastating detail in this passage is the phrase, "He did not know," because the departure of God's presence was not sudden. It was not a single cataclysmic moment in which the Spirit visibly departed with unmistakable evidence. It was the culmination of a gradual process of erosion that had been building for years, through compromise after compromise after compromise, each one enabled by the previous one, each one making the next one slightly more accessible and slightly less alarming. The 7 locks of hair did not represent the beginning of the problem. They represented the end of the process. The problem had begun in Timnah, with the woman who was right in his eyes. It had continued in every subsequent episode, where the sight of something desirable had overridden the call that had been placed on his life before his birth. It had been building through every instance in which Samson's personal inclinations had been given priority over the covenant relationship that was the actual source of his capacity. By the time Delilah's razor touched his head, the trajectory had been set for a long time. The hair was the last thing. Everything else had already been given away, and he did not notice. Not when the first lock was compromised, not when the pattern with women became established, not when the secret of the vow was disclosed to someone who had demonstrated 3 separate times that she would use that secret against him. He did not know. The theological language for what Samson was experiencing is hardening, the slow calcification of spiritual sensitivity that happens when repeated compromise is not interrupted by repentance. When the voice that warns and convicts is dismissed often enough that it eventually becomes inaudible. Not because God stopped speaking, because the capacity to hear had been eroded by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices to go in the other direction. This is the warning that Samson's story carries for everyone who has ever sat in a church and known in some private part of themselves that the version of their faith they present publicly and the actual state of their relationship with God are not the same thing. Not dramatically different, not in a way that would be obvious to the people around them, not in a way that has yet produced any visible crisis, just quietly different, slightly less real, somewhat more mechanical. The practice is maintained, but the power draining, the words still said, but the presence behind them growing more distant. The routine of religion continued while the relationship it was designed to express becomes increasingly theoretical. Check the hair. That is the invitation of this chapter. Before anything dramatic happens. Before the morning, when you wake up expecting to function in the power you assumed would always be there, and discover that the assumption was wrong. Check the condition of the thing that connects you to the source of everything you have been called to be and do. Because it is entirely possible to drift, as Samson drifted through a series of individually explicable and perhaps even sympathetic choices, to a place where you do not know that the Lord has left. And the discovering of that absence, when it comes, will be much harder than the maintaining of the presence would have been. The millstone turned. Day after day in the dark, Samson pushed the wooden beam that drove the grinding stone, the work of animals and slaves, the work assigned to the person who has been reduced to the lowest possible social position by the people who have conquered and captured them. The Philistines had taken everything from him that could be taken. His eyes, his freedom, his strength, his dignity, his position. The entire edifice of his identity as the champion of Israel, the unconquerable man, the one whose name made Philistine commanders calculate their casualties in advance and sometimes decide not to engage. All of it had been stripped away in the space of a single night, and a single act of the most final possible betrayal. And then tucked into the account almost as an aside, with a quietness that is completely disproportionate to its significance, the text records a single sentence that changes everything about the rest of the story. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. But that single conjunction carries the entire weight of divine grace in this passage, and I want to make sure you feel it. Everything that preceded it was the record of loss and consequence, and the absolutely predictable result of a life that had progressively moved away from the covenant it was built on. The losing of the eyes, the shackles, the grinding mill. These things followed from the choices with the same logic that cause and effect always follow from each other. They were not arbitrary. They were not cruel. They were the natural and in some sense just outcome of a specific set of decisions made over a specific period of time by a specific man who had been given an extraordinary gift and had treated it as though its maintenance was optional. But in the middle of the darkness and the grinding and the consequence and the blindness and the shame, his hair began to grow again. Not because he had demonstrated sufficient repentance, not because he had performed the necessary spiritual disciplines to earn back the favor of God, not because he had negotiated his way back into a position of covenant standing through the application of religious effort. His hair began to grow again because that is what hair does when you stop shaving it. It grows. It was not a dramatic supernatural intervention. It was a quiet biological reality. And yet, in the context of this story, it was the most theologically loaded biological reality imaginable. Because the hair was not just hair. The hair was the visible sign of the covenant. And the growing of the hair was God's way of keeping the door open. I want to describe what this means in the most direct and personal terms I can, because I think this is the sentence in the entire series of 8 chapters that has the most immediate relevance to the most people watching this right now. God's restoration often begins in the dark. It begins in the prison. It begins in the place of consequence, while you are still experiencing the full weight of what your choices produced, before you have any visible evidence that the trajectory is changing. It begins quietly, without announcement, without fanfare, without any sensation of spiritual breakthrough or any dramatic turning point that you can identify and date. Your hair is growing back right now in whatever situation you are in, whatever darkness you are currently inhabiting, whatever grinding you are currently doing as the consequence of whatever choices produce the consequences you are living with right now, in ways you cannot perceive and in processes you cannot observe. God is growing something back, not because you have earned the regrowth, not because you have achieved a sufficient level of remorse or completed a sufficient period of spiritual rehabilitation, because He is the God who keeps doors open, because He is the God who lets hair grow in the dark, because the covenant He made with you is not finally terminated by the worst version of your failure, and the purpose He placed in you before your birth has not been revoked by the most complete demonstration of your capacity for self-destruction. The Philistines were so confident in the permanence of their victory that they did not notice the hair. They took the eyes because they understood that sight was power, and taking the sight ensured the helplessness. But they left the hair because to them the hair was cosmetic. They did not understand what the hair represented, which means they did not understand that the thing they were most afraid of was growing back in the dungeon. They had put Samson in the dark, one day at a time, while he pushed the millstone in circles. The enemy never understands the hair. He never understands that the very place of captivity becomes the place of preparation. He never understands that the grinding of the millstone, the enforced stillness, the removal of every distraction and every arena of performance, and every source of identity beyond the most basic, that all of that can function as the specific context in which a person who has been running from a deeper engagement with God is finally still enough and broken enough and stripped enough to actually have it. The prison was not only consequence. The prison was also preparation. The grinding was not only humiliation. The grinding was also the slow, daily, rhythmic work of a God who was growing something back in the dark that would make the final chapter possible. The Philistine lords gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon and to celebrate. And the celebration had a specific content, a specific centerpiece, a specific reason for the particular joy that was filling the temple of Dagon on that day. Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. That was the declaration. That was what the sacrifice was about. That was the theological claim being made by the most powerful people in the Philistine Federation. that what had happened to Samson was evidence of the superiority of their God over the God of Israel. The capture, the blinding, the grinding mill, the broken covenant, the reduced and enslaved champion, all of it was being read as theological argument. Their God had won. The God of Israel had been demonstrated, by the facts on the ground, to be insufficient. They called for Samson to be brought out of the prison to entertain them. The word used for what they wanted him to do carries the connotation of performance. They wanted to display him, to use the spectacle of his degradation as part of the celebration of their victory. 3,000 men and women were in the temple. The lords of the Philistines were there. The roof was filled with people watching from above. It was the maximum possible audience for the maximum possible humiliation of the maximum possible symbol of everything they had been afraid of for a generation. And a young boy led Samson by the hand through the crowd to the center of the temple, where the great stone pillars stood that held the entire structure up. Here is where I want to draw your attention to the choreography of what God was doing in this moment, because the specifics matter and they are easy to miss if you are focused only on what the Philistines were seeing and planning. The Philistines wanted to make Samson a spectacle of their power, and in doing so they brought him to the exact location where the greatest demonstration of God's power was possible. They wanted him in the center of the temple. The center of the temple was where the pillars were. The pillars were what held the temple up, and a blind man who could not navigate the space independently needed to find the pillars by touch, which meant that the very act of leading him to the center of their celebration was the act of placing his hands on the instruments of their destruction. They designed the scene. God arranged the outcome within the scene they designed. They chose the stage. God chose what was going to happen on the stage they chose. This is a pattern that runs throughout the biblical narrative, and it is a pattern that I find extraordinarily encouraging for anyone who is in a situation that currently looks like nothing but the enemy's triumph. The enemy's arrangements consistently become the platforms for God's demonstrations. The pit that Joseph's brothers threw him into was the first step in the process that eventually put him at the right hand of Pharaoh. The cross that Rome used to execute Jesus was the instrument of the most significant event in the history of the universe. And the temple of Dagon, packed with 3,000 Philistines celebrating what they understood as a theological victory, became the stage for a moment that would be recorded and told and preached for 3,000 years as one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of the people of God. I want to speak to you specifically about the situation in your life that currently looks most like a Philistine celebration, the place where the enemy appears to have won decisively. The public failure, the visible humiliation, the circumstance that has been used by the wrong people to declare the wrong verdict about your life and your God. The situation where you have been brought into the center of someone else's victory, narrative, and put on display as evidence for conclusions you would never endorse. That stage, exactly that stage, the most uncomfortable and most apparently hopeless stage available, is the one that God has a history of choosing for his most decisive demonstrations. He is not embarrassed by your position in the center of someone else's triumph. He is not looking for a more favorable venue. He is not waiting for circumstances to improve before he does what he has been building toward. He has a history of walking into the most impossible-looking situation at the most impossible-seeming moment and doing something so completely outside the range of what anyone was calculating that the only available interpretation is God. That is his specialty. And the blind man in the center of the Philistine temple, hands reaching for pillars he could not see, was about to experience what his specialty looks like when it arrives. Samson asked the young boy to let him feel the pillars that the house rested on so that he could lean against them. He found them one with his right hand and one with his left. And the text pauses here in a way that feels almost cinematic. The way a story pauses before its most important moment. The way everything slows down when what is about to happen is large enough to deserve the weight of full attention. He prayed. And the prayer he prayed is so short and so theologically unimpressive by most standards of what a climactic prayer in a heroic story should sound like, that it is easy to read past it without fully absorbing what it is. There are no theological declarations. There is no review of God's promises or the covenant relationship or the history of what God had done for Israel. There is no bold proclamation of faith in the outcome or expression of certainty about what is about to happen. There is just a broken man with no eyes and growing hair, standing between two pillars in a temple full of people who believe his God has been defeated, asking for two things: remember me and strengthen me just this once. That is the entire prayer. The God who created the universe, the God who had announced Samson's birth through an angel, the God whose spirit had moved through him with extraordinary power at Timnah and Lehi and in the vineyards and on the roads of Philistia. This is what Samson asked him for. Remember me just this once. I want to talk about why this prayer is one of the most important prayers in the Bible, not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. Because this prayer could only be prayed by a man who had arrived at a very specific place. The place where every alternative to God had been exhausted, and every pretension of self-sufficiency had been stripped away, and every source of identity and confidence other than the raw relationship between himself and the God he had failed had been removed. You do not pray, remember me, if you have anything else to argue from. You pray, remember me, when you know you have nothing, no merit, no record, no accumulated spiritual capital to draw on, no impressive resume of faithfulness to present. And the only possible basis for your request is the character of the God you are asking, and whatever remnant of relationship with him still exists after everything you did to damage it. This is the prayer of complete humility. It is the prayer that acknowledges failure without minimizing it, that asks for grace without pretending to deserve it, that reaches toward God from the bottom of the most complete possible self-made disaster, and makes no argument for a favorable response except the single most important argument available. You know me, I am yours, even after everything. Remember me. And God answered. The text tells us that Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and leaned his weight against them. And then the record of what happened in his body is the most extraordinary sentence in the entire account of his life. He bowed with all his strength, not the strength of a broken slave who had been grinding grain in a dungeon, not the diminished, defeated, consequence-bearing strength of a man whose choices had reduced him from champion to captive. He bowed with all his strength. And what that phrase implies, given the result, given that the house fell on the lords and on all the people in it, is that what returned to Samson in response to that prayer was everything that the covenant had ever carried. The full measure of the Spirit, the complete restoration of what the intact relationship had always provided. The dead in whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. That sentence is the final theological statement about what remember me can produce when it is prayed honestly from the right place. His most significant contribution was not the lion, not the 1,000 Philistines, not the gates of Gaza on his shoulders. It was this, the broken, blind, enslaved, shamed, apparently finished man, who asked God to remember him one more time and died in the moment of the greatest victory of his life. The last prayer was the most powerful prayer. The most broken moment produced the most enduring fruit. The story of Samson ends with a burial. His brothers and all his father's house came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Between the places, between the location of his miraculous birth and the places where his life had been lived, it is a quiet ending for a loud life, and it carries in its quietness a kind of completion the story that began with an angel's announcement to a barren woman in a field has come to its conclusion. And the man who is born to begin the saving of Israel from the Philistines has done what he was born to do, even if he did it differently and at greater personal cost than anyone might have anticipated. I want to sit with you in this final chapter and talk about what the whole arc of Samson's story means for the specific people who are watching this right now. Because I am aware that this story touches something raw in a lot of people who would describe themselves as Christians, or former Christians, or people somewhere in the complicated middle. And I want to be honest about what it actually says, rather than softening it into something more comfortable. Samson wasted a significant portion of his potential. That is the honest reading of the story, and attempting to avoid it in the interest of encouragement would dishonor both the text and the people it is meant to reach. He was born with an extraordinary calling, an extraordinary gifting, and an extraordinary covenant relationship with God. And he spent years treating all of those things as though they were personal possessions that he could dispose of, according to his own preferences, rather than sacred deposits held in trust for a purpose larger than himself. The eyes, the chains, the grinding, the blindness, these were real. The consequences were real. The waste was real. And yet, there is a but in this story that is even larger than the but his hair began to grow. And it is this: the last prayer worked. The last breath counted. The most broken version of the most failed version of the most wasted potential in the book of Judges reached toward God from the bottom of everything and found that God had not moved, that the door that should by every reasonable accounting have been closed was still open, that the God who had called him before his birth and had watched him through every choice and every compromise and every failure had not revised the fundamental claim he had on this life. That remember me even from the bottom, even at the end, even after everything, was a prayer that God was waiting to answer. Your hair is growing back. I want to say those words directly to you because I believe they are true, and I believe they matter, and I believe that there are people watching this who have been told in one form or another that their hair is not growing back, that what they did was too much, that where they went was too far, that the specific combination of failure and consequence and time they have lived with has moved them outside the radius of what divine restoration can reach. They have been told this by the enemy, and they have been told it by their own internal voice. And sometimes they have been told it by religious communities that did not understand the grace they were misrepresenting. And the story of Samson stands in permanent opposition to every version of that message, because the hair grew back in the dungeon without his awareness, without his effort, while the consequences of his choices were still fully in effect, and the grinding was still happening, and the darkness was still complete. The restoration was already in process before the prayer was prayed. God was already moving before Samson had any idea that movement was happening. The but was already written into the story at the point that looked most like the final period. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to hear it not as a rhetorical device, but as a genuine and specific invitation. What do you need to ask God to remember right now? Not with a long prayer or an impressive prayer or a prayer that demonstrates you have the theology figured out. With a true prayer, with whatever honesty you have available to you in this moment, in whatever condition you are currently in. The blind man in the Philistine temple found both pillars by feel, and prayed 11 words, and God answered with the greatest moment of his life. That is the God you are dealing with. He is not waiting for you to be impressive. He is not waiting for you to have it together. He is waiting for the honest reach the prayer that acknowledges everything, expects nothing on its own merit, and trusts everything to the character of the God it is addressed to. Remember me, strengthen me, just this once. One more time. That is all it takes. That is always all it took. And the God who answered that prayer from the center of a collapsing Philistine temple is the same God who is waiting for it right now in whatever collapsing situation you are standing in, with whatever strength remains in you, and whatever growing hair is quietly accumulating in the dark places of your life that you have not yet been able to see. Your greatest victory may not be behind you. It may be exactly where Samson's was, waiting for the moment when you put your hands on the pillars and pray the simplest, most honest prayer of your life. The hair is growing, God is remembering, and the one more time you are afraid to ask for may be the moment the whole story has been building toward.